The Texas sun was setting, bathing the Austin skyline in warm tones of amber and crimson, as Jack Wallace leaned back in his ergonomic chair, listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioner blend with the soft tap of his keys. His office, on the 8th floor of a modern building downtown, was a reflection of his low-key ambition. Glass walls overlooked the Colorado River as it snaked through the city, and the interior balanced minimalist design with functional chaos. Monitors with endless lines of code, a whiteboard covered in algorithms, and a lone potted cactus on the windowsill, a nod to Jack's Texas roots. At 38, Jack was the epitome of a man who built something from nothing. His company, Securipath Solutions, wasn't a tech giant, but it had a solid foothold in the choppy waters of cybersecurity, serving local banks and building a reputation among mid-sized companies. Jack's hands, roughened not by physical labor, but by years of relentless typing, hovered over the keyboard as he debugged a particularly stubborn encryption protocol. His brow furrowed, not with irritation, but with the kind of focused determination that had accompanied him since he was a kid tinkering with his dad's old Commodore 64. Jack Wallace wasn't the type to shout his virtues from the rooftops. His staff, 22 of them, a tight-knit team, knew him as the boss who remembered birthdays, brought donuts on Fridays, and rarely raised his voice. He was lean, with the build of a runner, though he hadn't run in years. His dark hair, slightly gray at the temples, was always slightly tousled, as if he'd just run his hands through it while solving yet another problem. His brown eyes, sharp and attentive, noticed everything from a missed semicolon in a line of code to the subtle shift in a colleague's mood. Jack was a listener, a thinker, a man who believed in systems both in the software he built and in the lives he constructed with meticulous precision. It was a life that, to outsiders, seemed perfect. Jack and Laura Wallace lived in a 2-story craftsman-style house in the Hyde Park neighborhood, a charming spot where mighty oak trees cast long shadows across manicured lawns. Their home, painted a soft sage green with a wraparound porch, was where they sometimes sat with glasses of iced tea, waving to neighbors walking their dogs. Sometimes children would come over, their cheeks flushed, their fingers sticky with ice cream. Laura always kept homemade cookies in a floured tin she had inherited from her grandmother. The house was as immaculate inside as it was outside. In the entryway stood an old bookcase filled with books on architecture, family photos, and dried flowers. The dark oak floors creaked softly, as if whispering their own stories. In the living room hung watercolors brought from travels, and a cozy blanket casually thrown over the back of a chair gave the space a living warmth. The aroma of vanilla, cinnamon, or something else homey and calm always wafted from the kitchen. Laura loved to bake, and Jack loved to stand at the stove on weekends, making his signature waffles with caramelized apples. They had been married for 6 years, and their wedding photograph, framed in polished walnut on the living room mantel, captured a moment of apparent happiness. Jack in a sharp suit, smiling warmly but withholding, and Laura glowing in a flowing ivory dress, her red hair catching the light like a halo. The photograph, seemingly perfect, gave no hint that behind the facade lay silent evenings, conversations begun and not finished, and the slight tension that can only be felt when it becomes the background noise of everyday life. They were the couple who hosted barbecues, sent out thoughtful Christmas cards with special words for each family, and seemed to have cracked the code of modern American happiness. But sometimes, in the small hours before dawn, when the city was still asleep and the first rays of light touched the window frame, Laura sat alone in the kitchen, staring into a mug of cold coffee, and wondered why the perfect pictures in the frames bore so little resemblance to what she felt inside. But beneath that glossy surface, there were cracks. Not the kind that make headlines or provoke loud arguments, but the quiet, insidious kind that grows in the pauses between words, in the silences that go too long. Jack felt them, though he couldn't always name them. He'd see Laura staring out the kitchen window, her finger pensively running around the rim of her coffee mug, her mind somewhere he couldn't reach. She'd smile when he'd ask if everything was all right, but it was a closing door, not an invitation. He'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling fan, wondering when their conversations had become a series of polite transactions, talks about bills or schedules or the weather, rather than dreams and desires. Jack's days flowed with a rhythm of routine. He'd wake up at 6:30 a.m., brew a strong coffee to shake himself out, and kiss Laura's forehead as she tossed and turned in bed, her hair spilling across the pillow like autumn leaves. By 7:15, he'd be in his Tesla, navigating Austin's morning traffic, his mind already sorting through the day's tasks. At the office, he was in his element, solving problems, mentoring his team, and occasionally getting lost in the elegant logic of code. By 7 p.m., he'd be home, often with Laura's favorite Thai takeout, and they'd eat dinner at the dining room table, the clink of forks on plates filling the spaces where laughter had once filled the air. After dinner, Laura would retreat to her office to grade student papers or prepare lectures for a literature class at the local college, while Jack would break down code or read up on the latest cybersecurity threats. By 10:30, they were in bed, side by side, but not touching, each immersed in their own world, she in a novel, he in a tablet with industry blogs. Their marriage hadn't always been like this. Jack could still remember the early days when Laura was a whirlwind of energy and ideas. They'd met 8 years earlier at a friend's barbecue, where she'd been fervently discussing a paper with a group of graduate students. The Great Gatsby. Jack, never one for literature, was enchanted not by her analysis, but by the way she seemed to glow with life. She was 30, from Boston, with an infectious laugh and a habit of tucking her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. He was drawn to her passion, her hunger for meaning, and she was charmed by his quiet strength, his unobtrusive confidence. They dated for 2 years, a whirlwind of late-night conversations, weekend camping trips into the Texas hills, and stolen kisses in the back of his pickup under the stars. When he proposed on a bluff above Lake Travis, she cried and laughed and said yes before he could finish. Their wedding was small but perfect, not for the guests, but for them. In an old wooden barn outside the city, where the soft light of the setting sun filtered through the cracks in the boards, there were long tables covered with linen tablecloths, entwined with wild flowers and sprigs of rosemary. Strings of light bulbs swayed over the guests' heads, warming the evening not only from them, but from the heartfelt laughter, the smell of freshly baked goods, and the sounds of a playlist of Bob Dylan and the Lumineers walking hand in hand. Laura thought of every detail, from the hand-painted place cards to the vintage suitcase where guests placed wishes written on postcards from around the world. The vows were the most poignant moment. Jack's vows were simple, unadorned, but full of meaning. He talked about being there for her through the hard times, about listening and hearing, about her laughter being the most important thing to him. There was a firmness in his voice, as if he knew that love was a decision, a choice every day. Laura spoke as if she were writing a poem, about how they were ships floating down the same current, about how he was her north, her star, her home in each new city. Her voice shook, and she wiped away a tear before she finished. For the first year, they were inseparable. Their apartment in the city center was cramped but full of light, and the smell of fresh bread. Laura was learning to bake baguettes and brioche, and Jack, with his sleeves rolled up, was frying steaks in a tiny frying pan. They hosted dinners as if they were celebrity guests, not for someone else, but for themselves, with wine in glasses, music on the speakers, candles even on Tuesdays. On Saturdays, they went out into the countryside, exploring trails, collecting rocks, which Laura put in a jar labeled Memories. In the evenings, they read aloud to each other. Jack liked the classics, Laura liked novels with gentle irony. They dreamed of children, one or two, with her hair and his calm. Laura began a draft of her novel about the sincerity lost in the age of screens, and for the first time felt like she had found her voice. Jack worked until late at night, but always left her notes on the refrigerator. "Your eyes are my favorite story. Please don't eat all the lemon pie without me." They were the ones who believed that everything was still possible if you loved hard enough, if you looked in the same direction. But over time, the evening walks became less frequent, the to-do lists longer, and the conversations shorter. The letters on the refrigerator were replaced by reminders. "Pick up the dry cleaning, don't forget about the meeting, we're out of milk." And the jar of stones gathered dust on the top shelf of the closet. But then, in the first year, everything was different. And even now, when Laura looked at the wedding photo, She felt that tenderness was still there, just buried deep under layers of silence and habit. But somewhere along the way, the spark died. Jack couldn't quite put his finger on when it started. Maybe it was the long hours he spent at Securipath during the critical expansion, leaving Laura alone too often. Maybe it was her growing restlessness, the way she began talking about Paris or New York, cities that seemed like distant planets to Jack compared to his mundane world. She had always been ambitious, but her ambition was vague, rooted in a hunger for something bigger, brighter, more glamorous than their life in Austin. Jack was content. He loved their home, their routine, the quiet pride he took in building something that would last. He didn't understand her hunger for more, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to give it to her. Laura Wallace was a woman who caught everyone's attention, though she didn't seem to know it. At 34, she was strikingly beautiful, tall, willowy, with a cascade of red hair that she wore loose or in a messy bun that looked perfect. Her wardrobe was a mix of bohemian chic and academic elegance, flowing skirts with fitted blazers or jeans with silk blouses that shimmered in the light. She was the kind of teacher students adored, the kind who made Shakespeare feel alive and relevant, the kind who stayed after class to discuss Pride and Prejudice with a freshman in trouble. But beneath her warmth was a restlessness, a discontent that Jack sensed but couldn't name. She had always been drawn to beauty, to art, to the idea of a life worthy of history. Austin, with its laid-back vibe and techno-bro culture, sometimes felt too small. She talked about moving to a city where ideas sparkled in the air, where she could write in cafes that smelled of espresso and ambition. Jack listened, nodding, but his mind drifted to practical matters: mortgages, staff salaries, the next software release. Their differences had once been their strength. Jack balanced Laura, his pragmatism balancing her idealism. She pushed him to dream big, to see beyond lines of code and invoices. But now those differences are a chasm. Laura would come home from class, her eyes shining with stories about students or the new romance she had discovered, and Jack would try to match her energy, asking questions, smiling. But he could feel the distance growing, her stories trailing off when she noticed he was not fully there, his mind half occupied with an urgent letter from a client. He caught her glances, not angry, but with a quiet sadness, as if she were searching for the man she had married and finding only a shadow of him. Jack wasn't blind. He loved Laura, he loved her fiercely, the way he approached everything relentlessly, unwaveringly. He built his life around her, around them, and he believed that what was broken could be fixed. He began leaving work early, suggesting nights out at new restaurants or weekend trips to the coast. But Laura's responses were polite, not enthusiastic. She agreed, she smiled, she played the part, but there was an emptiness to it, a sense that she was playing the part. Jack didn't know how to reach her, and the harder he tried, the more he felt her slipping away. Today, as Jack drove home in the gathering dusk, he thought about Laura. He was planning to surprise her with tickets to a literary event, a poetry reading that he hoped would bring the sparkle back into her eyes. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, his fingers drumming against the leather as The drive to Austin Bergstrom Airport was bathed in morning light, rays filtering through the sparse clouds and reflecting off the hood of Jack Wallace's Tesla. He drove in silence, his fingers gripping the wheel as his to-do list raced through his head. Send final code edits to his team, review the client presentation, call Laura before landing. The contract in Seattle was too big to pass up. One of Washington State's largest banks was looking for a new encryption system to protect its transactions, and Securipath Solutions was on the short list. It was a chance to take the company to the next level, but Jack couldn't shake the tugging feeling in his chest. He was going away for 3 weeks, leaving Laura alone in their big house in Hyde Park, and the thought was a dull unease. Laura sat in the passenger seat, looking out the window. Her red hair was pulled back into a low bun, and the light gray cardigan she wore over a white blouse made her look both sophisticated and casual. She hadn't spoken since they left the house, and the silence between them felt heavier than usual. Jack glanced at her, hoping to catch some hint of her thoughts, but her face was as unreadable as the page of a book he could never quite understand. "Are you sure everything's okay?" he asked. trying to keep his voice casual. I can ask Melissa to come by if anything happens. She's always happy to help. Laura turned to face him, her green eyes meeting him for only a moment before she looked out the window again. "It's okay, Jack," she replied, her tone even, almost mechanical. "I can handle it. It's only 3 weeks." He nodded, but Laura's words did not reassure him. He knew she was not helpless. Laura was a woman who could organize a literary evening for 100 students, or give a lecture without taking a single note. But something in her voice, in the way she avoided his gaze, made him feel that he was leaving not just a wife, but something fragile that he had not yet had time to name. "I installed a smart home system," he continued, trying to fill the silence. "Cameras, sensors, everything is connected to your phone. If something goes wrong, you'll know right away. And I'm always available, you know that." Laura smiled slightly, but it was more polite than warm. "You always think ahead," she said, a hint of irony in her voice. "You even installed cameras. What, are you afraid I'll throw a party while you're away?" Jack laughed, but it was forced. "No, I just want you to feel safe. And besides, there's a construction site across the street. Better to be on guard." She nodded without looking at him. Silence filled the cabin again, only the hiss of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional click of the turn signals reminded them that they were still moving. "Security is good," Laura said finally. "But do you ever think about trust?" "What?" He glanced at her, briefly but attentively. "Well," she shrugged slightly, "it's simple. When everything is locked, behind cameras and passwords, does it protect us or alienate us?" "It's just a technique, Lore," he replied calmly, trying not to raise his voice. "It's not a substitute for trust. It's a help, just in case." "It's just that any case happens more and more often," she said, looking out the window. "And I'm not even talking about the neighbors." Jack frowned. "Is it because of that conversation with Rachel?" "No," she answered quickly. "Although, maybe partly. It's just, I don't know. Sometimes it seems to me that you're building not a house, but a fortress. And I like the decoration in it. An appendix to the security system." He exhaled slowly and gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Laura, it's not fair. I work so that we have everything, so that you can write, do what you love, so that you don't have to think about bills, about how to survive until the end of the month. I didn't ask you to decide everything for me," she said quietly but sharply. "I wanted us to be a team, and now every day is like an operation with instructions. Even our marriage has become optimized." "Lore." "No, don't," she shook her head. "Just go, do what you have to do. I can handle it. The smart home will warn me if I start to become a problem." There was complete silence for a few seconds. Then Jack said slowly, "I don't want you to be alone, but it seems like you've been feeling that way for a long time." She didn't answer. She just turned to the window and ran her finger along the fogged glass, as if she were searching for some clarity in this simple gesture that she had long since lost. At the airport, Jack parked at the terminal, pulled his suitcase out of the trunk, and turned to face Laura. She stepped out of the car, wrapping her arms around herself as if to protect herself from the morning chill. He took a step toward her, wanting to embrace her, but she beat him to it, reaching out to straighten the collar of his shirt. "You look like a real businessman," she said with a slight smile, but her eyes were distant. "Seattle won't know what's coming." "I hope so," Jack replied, trying to catch her eye. "Laura, if there's something wrong, you'll tell me, right? I can cut the trip short if—" "Jack," she interrupted, her voice a little sharper. "I told you, it's okay. Go get your contract. This is what you live for." The word stung, though he wasn't sure if she meant to. He wanted to protest, to say that he lived for her, for them, but instead he just nodded. "I'll call you as soon as I land," he said, leaning down to kiss her cheek. Her skin was cool, and she pulled away slightly, barely noticeable, but enough for him to feel it. "Good luck, Jack," she replied, retreating to the car. "Don't worry about me." He watched her get behind the wheel and drive away, the Tesla's red tail lights disappearing into the traffic. His chest tightened, but he turned and headed toward the terminal, clutching the handle of his suitcase a little too tightly. Seattle greeted Jack with gray skies and the smell of rain. He checked into a small but stylish hotel downtown, overlooking Puget Sound. His days quickly settled into a rhythm. Morning meetings with bank representatives, afternoon sessions with engineers testing his system, and evenings in his room tweaking code or preparing reports. The contract was complex, but Jack was in his element. He loved a challenge, where every problem had a solution if you dug deep enough. He was respected in the bank office for his precision and ability to explain complex ideas in simple terms, and he sensed that the deal was close. But in the evenings, when the city outside the window lit up with lights and the room became too quiet, Jack thought about Laura. He called her every day, but the conversations were short, almost formal. "How are you?" he asked, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the raindrops running down the glass. "Everything is fine," she replied, and he could hear her shuffling papers or pouring tea. "The students were great today, discussing Kafka. How are you?" "There is progress," he said, trying to put enthusiasm into his voice. "I think we'll sign everything in a couple of weeks." "Very well," she replied, and the pause hung between them like an abyss. "Well, I must go, Jack. I have an early lecture tomorrow." "Of course," he said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "Good night, Laura." "Calm down," she replied, and the line was disconnected. He stared at his phone, trying to remember when their conversations had become so empty. He missed her, not just her presence, but the Laura who laughed at his jokes, who could talk for hours about books or dream about the future. Now she seemed distant, not just because of the thousands of miles, but because of something deeper he couldn't quite place. Meanwhile, in Austin, Laura woke up alone in their large house. The first few days without Jack were strangely liberating. She could cook only what she wanted, play music louder than usual, or leave dishes in the sink without hearing his gentle, "Let's clean up." But soon the silence of the house began to weigh on her. She wandered through the rooms, her footsteps echoing off the wood floors, and every corner was a reminder of Jack, his programming books on the shelf, his emblazoned coffee mug, his neatly folded shirts in the closet. The smart home system he'd installed before he left was both a relief and an annoyance. Cameras recorded every movement outside, sensors reported every time a door opened, and an app on her phone let her control the lights, thermostat, even the coffee maker. Jack explained everything with meticulous precision, showing her how to check the camera feeds or set off the alarm. For security, he'd said, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that he was trying to control not just the house, but her, too. One evening, after a lecture, she sat at the kitchen island, sipping wine and looking at a notification from the system. Front door unlocked at 6:32 p.m. It was her, but the message gave her a strange feeling, as if the house were watching her, like Jack's proxy. She opened the app, scrolling through the CCTV footage, showing the empty yard and the construction site across the street, where workers in orange vests were laying the foundation of a new house. Everything was calm, too calm. "Does he really think I can't handle this?" she muttered to the empty kitchen. She put down her glass and stood up to put on some music, something lively, with guitar riffs to help clear the silence. The next day, she met a friend, Emily, at a downtown cafe. Emily, an artist with bright blue streaks in her hair, was Laura's opposite, outgoing, impulsive, living in the moment. They sat at a table outside, sipping lattes while Emily talked about her latest exhibition. "What about you, Laura?" Emily asked, leaning closer. "Doesn't the house feel a little empty without Jack?" Laura shrugged, fiddling with the edge of her napkin. "I'm coping. It's weird, but sometimes it's nice to be alone. You can do whatever you want." Emily narrowed her eyes, her gaze penetrating. "Are you sure? You look like you need a shake. When was the last time you did something crazy?" Laura laughed, but it was more out of politeness. "Crazy? Emily, I teach literature. My crazy thing is getting students to read Ulysses." "That's not it." Emily waved her hand dismissively. "I mean real life. Travel, adventure, something that makes your heart beat faster. You don't want to sit in this nice house your whole life, do you? Laura paused, her fingers hovering over her napkin. Emily's words had touched something deep inside her, a part of her that craved more than lectures and quiet evenings. She thought of the Paris she dreamed of the cafes where she could write, of a life that would be more than this. But then she thought of Jack, his reliability, his love, his efforts to keep their marriage afloat, and guilt washed over her. Maybe you're right, she said quietly, but I don't know where to start. Emily smiled, her eyes lighting up. Start small. A party, a trip, a new project. You deserve something more, Laura. In Seattle, Jack felt something slipping away, too. He sat in a conference room, pitching his system to the bank's board, but his thoughts kept returning to Laura. He remembered their last conversation before he left, her telling him he lived for contracts. It wasn't fair, but there was some truth to it. He loved his job, he loved solving problems, building systems that worked flawlessly. But he also loved Laura, and the thought of her being unhappy ate away at him. That evening he called her again, standing at the window of his room, looking out at the lights of Seattle. "Hello," he said when she answered. "How are you?" "Fine," she said, and he heard her open the fridge. "Just got back from Emily's. We were having coffee, chatting." "Sounds great," he said, trying to sound cheerful. "What's new?" "Nothing special," she replied, and he could feel her withdrawing, even through the phone. "And you?" "The contract is moving," he said. "I think we're close. Laura, I miss you." The pause was long, too long. "Me too," she finally said, but her voice was quiet, almost uncertain. When the call ended, Jack stared at his phone for a long moment, trying to figure out what he was missing. He opened the smart home app, checked the camera's empty yard, silence. But instead of reassurance, he felt only emptiness. Laura was there in their house, but she had never seemed so far away. The rain had been falling steadily in Seattle for 3 days, drumming against the windows of Jack Wallace's hotel like a persistent rhythm he couldn't ignore. His 14th floor room was cozy, but sterile white sheets, a glass table, a minibar he hadn't touched. Jack sat on the edge of the bed, his phone in his hand, the screen glowing a soft blue, displaying a recent call to Laura that had lasted exactly 4 minutes and 32 seconds. He stared at the numbers as if they might explain why their conversations had become so short, so empty. He'd called her every night since he'd arrived in Seattle, and each time he'd felt an invisible wall growing between them, brick by brick, with each evasive answer from Laura. Today's call was no exception. Jack dialed her number at 8:15 p.m. local time, knowing it was already 10:15 a.m. in Austin. She answered on the third ring, her voice soft, but with a tired edge he couldn't help but notice. "Hello," he said, trying to put the warmth he so sorely lacked into his voice. "How was your day?" "Fine," Laura said, and he heard her shifting something in the background, perhaps a book or a plate. "Lectures as usual. Students were more active today, discussing Moby Dick. And you?" "The presentation went well," Jack said, looking out the window at the dark silhouette of the city. "It looks like the bank is ready to sign the contract. A couple more meetings, and I think everything will be decided." "That's great," she said, but there was no enthusiasm in her voice, just polite support. "You always get your way." He paused, trying to find words that could break through this wall. "Laura, are you okay? You sound, I don't know, tired." "Just tired, Jack," she replied quickly, almost sharply. "Lots of work. You know how it is." "Yeah, I know," he said, though his instincts told him it wasn't just about work. "If something's wrong, you'll tell me, right?" "Sure," she said, but the pause before the word was too long, as if she were choosing her answer rather than speaking from the heart. "Listen, I need to finish this paperwork. Let's do it tomorrow." "Yes, of course," he said, clutching the phone a little tighter. "Good night, Laura." "Calm down," she replied, and the line went dead. Jack leaned back against the headboard, staring at the ceiling. He felt something tightening in his chest, not pain, more like a shadow of doubt he didn't want to acknowledge. Laura had always been reserved, but there used to be a tenderness in her voice, a sparkle that made their conversations lively, even when they were talking about trivial matters. Now her words were like a faded photograph, familiar but colorless. She wrote less, called less. In the early days of his trip, she had sent short messages, a photo of the sunset over Austin, a joke about a student confusing Shakespeare with Shelley. But now even those were rare, and when he wrote to her, the replies were late, monosyllabic, as if she were doing something rather than talking to her husband. He opened their text messages, scrolling through the last week. I'm fine, busy day. I have a lecture soon, I'll text you later. Don't worry, I'm fine. Each word was correct, but together they formed a picture that unsettled him. He knew Laura the way she tugged at her hair when she was nervous, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about books, the way she laughed when he tried to make something more complicated than a sandwich. But this Laura he'd spoken to on the phone was different, distant, as if she'd closed off a part of herself he'd grown accustomed to having access to. Jack stood up and went to the window, looking out at the lights of Seattle flickering through the rain. He tried to tell himself it was his imagination, that he was projecting his fears onto their marriage. Laura was tired, she had a lot of work, and he thought too much. But the doubts, like raindrops, kept falling, one after another, until they began to form puddles. The next day, Jack sat in the bank's conference room, but his mind was far from the presentation. He answered questions mechanically, showed graphs of system performance, but his mind kept returning to Laura. He recalled their last conversation, her dry tone, her evasive answers. He tried to remember the last time she had called him honey or said, I love you. Was it before he left? Or even earlier? He couldn't remember for sure, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. After the meeting, he returned to his hotel room, opened his laptop, and launched the Smart Home app. He'd installed the system before he left to monitor the construction site across the street and keep his home safe. Cameras monitored the yard, the front door, the back garden, and sensors reported every time a window or door was opened. He'd told Laura it was for her peace of mind, but now, looking at the screen, he felt different. This wasn't just about monitoring the house, it was a way to peer into her world while he was so far away. He pulled up the security footage from the previous evening. The video showed an empty yard lit by streetlights, a construction site across the street where workers were putting away tools at the end of the day. Nothing out of the ordinary. He switched to the camera by the front door, scrolling through the footage until 6:32 p.m., when Laura returned home. She walked in carrying a bag of books. Her movements routine, she took off her coat, hung it on a hook, and disappeared into the house. Everything looked normal, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He scrolled past the camera until late in the evening, when the lights in the living room went out and then came on in the bedroom. Nothing out of the ordinary, but his fingers hovered over the keyboard. He opened the sensor log. The door had opened only once, when Laura had come home. No windows had opened. No movement alerts in the yard. Everything was fine. So why did he feel like he was missing something? He closed the laptop, but the doubts persisted. He told himself it was stupid, that he shouldn't spy on his own wife. But the idea that she might be hiding something was already taking root. In Austin, Laura sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of student essays, an open copy of Herman Melville, and a cold cup of coffee forgotten mid-paragraph. Outside, rain was falling, a rare, almost ceremonial guest in these parts, and its soft, measured tapping on the glass was the only sound in the house. It seemed to accompany her thoughts, unhurried, viscous, wandering away from the text. Laura tried to concentrate, to analyze the students' arguments, but each time her gaze slipped beyond the pages, returning to one thing, to the conversation with Jack, to his voice, to the awkward silence between them. He called last night, as he had promised. His voice was calm as always, even gentle, but she heard something else in a distance, busyness, perhaps guilt. He talked about the conference, about the cameras finally working at the construction site, about how busy he was and how tired he was. She listened, nodding into the air, as if everything was fine, and he seemed to believe, or pretended to believe. The truth was, Laura felt lonely not just because of his absence, but because of how familiar that absence had become. Even when Jack was there, it was as if there was a space between them, an emptiness that nothing could fill. Their conversations had become short, practical. Did you get the mail? What should I get for dinner? Have you seen my laptop? The lightness had gone out of them, the laughter. Or was it that she had changed? Different, more withdrawn, less patient, more demanding of things she had once taken for granted. She stood up, went to the window, and looked out at the construction site across the street. Workers in yellow hard hats swarmed through the rain, their movements mechanical, like slow motion. The cameras Jack had installed were watching them, and the thought irritated her. Everything about Jack was about control, systems, rules, schedules, logic. He loved order and predictability, as if he could ensure their marriage from cracking just by installing another camera or buying a new motion sensor. But Laura no longer felt like part of the pattern. She was no longer an object of observation. She was the woman who had lived with him for 10 years, who knew the way his brow furrowed when he thought, the way he mumbled incoherently in the morning until he drank his coffee. She knew his pain and his fears, and she knew that beneath all this control mania was an insecurity. Maybe he really didn't know how else to show that he loved her, how else to say, "I'm afraid of losing you." Laura returned to the table, sat down, picked up her phone, and opened their correspondence. The last message from Jack, "I'll call you tonight. I love you." She didn't answer. She read it over and over again, as if there was some code, a key to understanding, hidden in those 5 words. She wanted to answer, to write, "And I love you too. I'm waiting for your call." Or simply, "I need you." But none of these words seemed honest to her, because she was tired, because she didn't know anymore whether they needed each other or were simply afraid to admit that they had become strangers. Instead, she wrote to Emily, "Want to meet tomorrow? Need to get out of the house." The answer came almost instantly. "Yeah, let's go to a bar on South Congress. It's time to shake things up." Laura smiled, not widely, not happily, but warmly. There was something alive, something real about Emily, a reminder of who Laura had once been. Before marriage, before college, before stability became more important than freedom. Then they could walk around the city until dawn, laugh for no reason, make plans without looking back to the future. And maybe an evening with Emily could remind her that she was still alive, that there was something inside her that wanted to be seen, heard. But when the screen went dark and the room was silent again, Laura felt uneasy. She wasn't sure what she wanted. A party? Freedom? Or just touch not physical, but warm, honest. She loved Jack. She loved him, but love had become heavy, like a suitcase carried alone. She remembered their first years, how he would read her poetry in bed, how he would stroke her hair, how his kisses were complete, unconditional truth. They had seemed one then, that nothing could break their union. Now their marriage was like a book she had been reading for too long, familiar to the last line, but no longer filled with awe or delight. She didn't want to close the book, not yet, but maybe it was time to turn the page. And the rain kept coming, as if it knew that there was something more to the evening than just a desire to shake things up. Jack called again the following evening, and the conversation was almost a mirror image of the previous one. Laura answered briefly, her voice soft but lacking in warmth. She mentioned that she was seeing Emily, and Jack felt a twinge of relief, at least she wasn't alone. But the relief quickly turned to alarm when she quickly ended the conversation, citing the late hour. "Laura," he said before she hung up, "I'll be back in 2 weeks. Maybe we can do something special. A trip, dinner, anything." "Of course," she replied, but there was no spark in her voice. "Let's discuss it when you get back." When the call ended, Jack opened the smart home app again. He told himself he was just checking to make sure everything was okay, but his fingers moved of their own accord, opening the camera feeds. He watched Laura leave the house at 7:45 p.m., wearing a black dress he hadn't seen before. She looked beautiful, but not in a way that she usually wore, not for a lecture, not for dinner with friends. This was a dress for something else, and the thought pierced him like a needle. He closed the app, cursing himself. He didn't want to be the husband who snooped, who suspected the worst. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew, fed by her dry answers, her distance, her new dress. He went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he lay staring into the darkness, wondering what would happen if he was right, and what would happen if he was wrong. The rain in Seattle was a familiar backdrop to Jack Wallace's life, its rhythmic tapping on the hotel windows, the only sound in the quiet of his room in the late hours. He sat at his small desk, his laptop open, the screen glowing a soft blue that caught his tired eyes. The deal with the bank was almost done, the final edits to the presentation were done. The engineers had approved a test run of the system. But instead of satisfaction, Jack felt a heaviness that grew more noticeable with each passing day. His calls with Laura had become a ritual devoid of warmth. Short sentences, polite answers, pauses that cut deeper than words. He tried to dismiss his suspicions, chalking them up to fatigue, to distance, to his imagination. But they returned like shadows clinging to the edges of his consciousness. He called Laura again that evening, sitting on the edge of his bed, the phone pressed to his ear. It was 9:47 p.m. Seattle time, almost midnight in Austin. She answered on the fifth ring, her voice muffled, as if she'd just woken up or been somewhere she didn't want to speak loudly. "Hello," Jack said, trying to sound casual, even though his heart was beating faster than usual. "Didn't wake you?" "No, I'm fine," Laura said, and he heard her shift, perhaps getting up from the couch or leaving the room. "Just sitting, reading. How are you?" "Okay," he lied, looking at the reflection of the city in the window. "Tomorrow is the final meeting with the bank. I think we'll sign the contract." "Excellent," she said, but there was no joy in her voice. "You're doing great, Jack." He paused, waiting for her to say more, but the silence hung between them like a thick fog. He wanted to ask why she sounded so distant, why she had stopped writing, why their conversations had become so businesslike. But instead he said, "Laura, are you sure you're okay? If something's wrong, I can fly in earlier." "Jack, I'm fine," she said, a hint of irritation in her voice. "Just tired. Lots of work, you know." "I know," he said, though he knew it wasn't the whole truth. "Okay, I won't keep you. Good night." "Calm down," she replied, and the line went dead. Jack set his phone down on the table, his fingers hovering over the screen. He felt something tightening inside him, as if someone was slowly squeezing the air out of his lungs. He stood up, paced the room, trying to push the worry away, but it didn't go away. Instead, it pushed him toward his laptop, toward the smart home app he opened more often than he'd like to admit. He told himself it was just a test, the construction across the street, the home's security, nothing more. But the truth was, he was looking for answers that Laura wasn't giving him. He opened the app, and the screen filled with black and white camera feeds. The outside cameras showed an empty yard lit by streetlights and a construction site quiet for the night. He switched to the camera by the front door, scrolling back to 11:30 p.m., when Laura had been, in her words, reading. The video loaded, and Jack froze. Laura walked into the house at 11:17 p.m., but she wasn't alone. There was a man walking beside her, tall, with short dark hair, wearing a leather jacket and jeans. He moved with an easy confidence, his hand brushing Laura's back as they walked up the porch steps. Jack felt the blood drain from his face. He rewound the footage, then fast-forwarded, hoping it was a mistake that he'd misunderstood. But the camera was right. Laura walked into the house with a stranger, her hand on his elbow, and there was a smile on her face, not the polite one she gave Jack, but a different one, lively, almost playful. He switched to the living room camera, his fingers shaking as he typed in the password. The video loaded, and his worst fears began to take shape. Laura and the man were sitting on the couch, the same couch where she and Jack had watched movies on the weekends, where he had first kissed her 8 years ago. The man leaned toward her, his hand on her knee, and Laura didn't pull away. Within minutes, they were kissing, not hurriedly, not casually, but with a hunger that made Jack turn away from the screen. His stomach clenched, his throat dry. He closed the laptop, but the images were already seared into his mind like a hot brand. He stood up, walked to the window, and pressed his forehead against the cold glass. The rain continued to fall, its rhythm now seeming like a mockery. He tried to find an explanation, rational, logical, like the lines of code he knew how to correct. Maybe it was an old friend, a colleague. But he knew Laura, he knew her movements, her laugh. He knew what she looked like when she was happy. This was not a friendly meeting. It was something else, something he did not want to name. The next day, Jack could barely concentrate on the meeting with the bank. His colleagues noticed that he was distracted, but they chalked it up to fatigue. He signed a contract, shook hands, smiled for a photo, but it was all mechanical, as if he were watching himself from the outside. Back at the hotel, he opened the smart home app again. He told himself he shouldn't, that this was wrong, but he couldn't stop. He scrolled through the next day's recordings, and his heart sank again. At 9:43 p.m., Laura came home with another man. This one was younger, with wild blonde hair and a shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He was carrying a bottle of wine, and Laura was laughing, her hand on his shoulder as they walked into the house. The camera in the living room showed them drinking wine, sitting close to each other, their conversation animated, full of gestures and laughter. Jack watched Laura throw her head back, laughing at something this man said, and he felt something inside him break. This wasn't his Laura, not the woman who'd read poetry at their wedding, not the one who'd promised to be with him through thick and thin. Or maybe it was her, but a part of her he'd never seen. He closed his laptop, his breathing ragged. He wanted to call her, demand an explanation, but what could he say? "I saw you kissing another man on our couch." He imagined her voice calm, evasive, like their last conversations. "Are you spying on me, Jack?" she would say, and he would be unable to answer. He felt like a traitor, but Laura's betrayal was sharper, deeper, like a knife he hadn't seen until it had driven into his chest. 3 days later, Jack opened the app again, his fingers moving almost against his will. He hadn't slept more than 4 hours a night, his eyes were bloodshot, his thoughts jumbled like poorly written code. He scrolled back to 10:15 p.m., and what he saw was worse than anything he could have imagined. Laura had walked into the house with two men. One was the one with the leather jacket he'd never seen before. The other was a stranger, tall, with neatly combed hair and a dark suit. They were laughing, their voices coming through the camera's microphone as they took off their coats and walked into the living room. Laura was carrying a bottle of whiskey, her movements loose, almost brash. She turned on some music, something bass-heavy, not like her usual folk and classical playlists. The camera showed them dancing, their bodies moving too close, their hands touching too loosely. Jack watched, unable to look away, though each frame was a blow. He saw Laura laugh, her hair falling in her face, one of the men leaning down to kiss her neck, the other standing next to her, his hand on her waist. This was no accident, no mistake. This was another Laura, or maybe the real Laura, the one he'd never known. He closed the laptop, his hands shaking, his mind racing with thoughts anger, hurt, disbelief, shame for watching, for not stopping. He stood up, walked to the minibar, opened a bottle of water, but couldn't take a sip. His mind was an overloaded server, unable to process the flood of data. He thought about their wedding, about her vows, about the way she looked at him as they danced under the stars. He thought about the years they had spent together, their plans for the future, the child they never had. And now he saw her with other men, in their house, on their couch, in their lives. He wanted to scream, he wanted to fly to Austin, he wanted to erase these images from his memory, but he couldn't move. Jack didn't call Laura that night. He didn't know what to say, how to say it without revealing his pain. Instead, he sat in the dark, looking out at the lights of Seattle, trying to figure out what to do next. He felt like a man whose world had fallen apart, but the pieces still held together, as if by inertia. He thought about going home, confronting her, asking her why. But the fear of what she would say, or worse, that she wouldn't say anything, held him back. He opened the laptop again, not to look at the notes, but to write a letter. He began, "Laura, I don't know how to say this." But the words wouldn't come. He erased them, closed the laptop, and went to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Instead, he lay staring at the ceiling, wondering how their marriage had gotten this way, how he hadn't noticed how the person he loved most had become a stranger to him. Seattle saw Jack Wallace off with gray skies and a cold wind that cut into his bones as he loaded his suitcase into a taxi to the airport. His bank contract had been signed, handshakes had been made, smiles had been forced for photos, but it all seemed distant, like someone else's life. The last few days, images from the smart home cameras had been playing in his head. Laura, her laughter, her hands on strangers' shoulders, her lips kissing strangers. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, couldn't think of anything but the betrayal that was eating away at him like acid. He hadn't told Laura he was moving back to Austin. He hadn't called, hadn't written. For the first time in their marriage, he wanted his actions to speak louder than words. On the plane, Jack sat by the window, looking out at clouds that seemed as shapeless and elusive as his thoughts. He opened his laptop, connected to the Wi-Fi, and reviewed the recordings he'd saved to an encrypted external drive. He worked methodically, like a programmer parsing a tangled code. Each entry was tagged with a date, time, and location. He isolated the men's faces, using image enhancement software to eliminate any doubt. The first man, the one in the leather jacket, was David Reynolds, the principal at the school where Laura taught literature. Jack recognized him from a photo Laura had once shown him from an annual school event. The second was even more painful. Mark Haley, an old friend of Jack's from their Friday night poker games at a bar on South Lamar. Mark, with his loud laugh and habit of slapping Jack on the back, was the one kissing his wife in their living room. The third man, the one in the jacket, remained unknown, but Jack preserved his face, his gestures, even snippets of conversation that the camera's microphone picked up. He saved everything, every video, every sound, every moment that could be used as evidence. He didn't know how far he'd go, but he knew he wouldn't let the footage fade into silence. His fingers shook as he copied the files onto 2 external drives, one of which he hid in a secret compartment in his suitcase. He wasn't sure what he was going to do with the copies for his lawyer, for the court, for Laura to throw in her face, but he felt he had to be ready. His mind, accustomed to patterns and logic, demanded order even as his heart ached. Jack took a cab from the Austin airport, but not home. He asked the driver to take him to a small motel on the outskirts of town, in an area where neon signs blinked over gas stations and fast food joints. He didn't want Laura to know he was back. Not yet. He checked into a room under an assumed name, paid cash, and locked himself in a room that smelled of old carpet and cleaning supplies. There, on the narrow bed, he opened his laptop and began to plot. The first thing he did was find a lawyer. He wasn't looking for just any lawyer, but someone who understood divorce and wasn't afraid of the dirty details. After an hour of searching online, he settled on Elizabeth Carter, a woman with a reputation as a courtroom bulldog. Her website promised discretion and determination, and client testimonials spoke of her ability to win high-stakes cases. Jack sent her an email with a brief description of the situation, without going into detail, and asked to meet the next day. He didn't know if he wanted a divorce, but he wanted to be prepared for anything. Then he went back to the recordings. He plugged the second drive into his laptop and started backing up, encrypting them with an algorithm he'd written for SecurePath clients. He didn't trust cloud storage, too easy to hack, too easy to lose. He also took screenshots of keyframes. Laura and David on the couch, their lips locked in a kiss. Mark with his arm around Laura at the kitchen island. A third man with his hand on her thigh as they danced to music Jack didn't recognize. He saved audio files that captured snippets of their conversations. Laura's laughter, David's deep voice saying something about freedom, Mark's joke that made Laura throw her head back. Each file was a knife, but Jack kept going. He cataloged them as if it were a project at work, where every detail mattered. The next day, Jack met Elizabeth Carter at her office in downtown Austin. The building was modern, with marble floors and glass walls, but Elizabeth's office was cozy, with bookshelves and a photograph of her dog on her desk. She was a woman in her 50s, with short gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see more than Jack wanted to let on. "Mr. Wallace," she began, gesturing to the leather chair opposite her. "You wrote that you have a situation with your spouse. Tell me more." Jack hesitated, his fingers tightening on the armrests. He wasn't ready to spill the beans, but he knew he had to start. "I found evidence that my wife, Laura, is cheating on me," he said, his voice low, almost hoarse. "I have recordings, videos. I want to know what my options are." Elizabeth raised an eyebrow, but her face remained calm and professional. "Proof is good," she said, making a note on her pad. "Texas is a fault-based divorce state, which means infidelity can affect property division and child support. But let's be clear, do you want a divorce or something else?" Jack looked down at his hands, clenched into fists. He didn't know the answer. He wanted to punish Laura, wanted her to feel the same pain he was feeling, but the thought of divorce, of the end of their marriage, felt too final. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I just want to be prepared, and I want her to know that I know." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes softening but her voice remaining businesslike. "Good. Bring me copies of the tapes. I'll look at what you have, and we'll discuss strategy. If you decide to move forward, we can use this for negotiations or in court. But Mr. Wallace, let me give you a word of advice. Don't do anything impulsive. Emotions are a poor guide in these matters." Jack nodded, though his mind was full of impulses to scream, to break, to demand answers. He handed Elizabeth a flash drive containing copies of the files, encrypted with a password he whispered to her as if it were a state secret. "I'll contact you tomorrow," she said, standing. "And Jack, keep a grip. This isn't the end of the world, even if it feels like it right now." He left her office feeling both lighter and heavier. Lighter because he had taken the first step. Heavier because each step brought him closer to a reality he did not want to accept. Jack didn't go home. Instead, he rented a car, a nondescript gray sedan that didn't attract attention, and parked a block from their house in Hyde Park. It was dark now, the streetlights cast a soft glow on the sidewalks, and the oak trees rustled in the breeze. He sat in the car, looking at their house, where the light was on in the living room. He could see Laura's silhouette through the curtains, moving around the room, perhaps with a book or a glass of wine. He waited, not knowing what for. Maybe he wanted to see one of the men, wanted to catch them in the act, wanted to prove to himself that this wasn't a dream. At 9:30 p.m., a car pulled up a black SUV that Jack recognized. It was Mark. His old friend got out, straightened his shirt, and headed for the front door. Jack felt the blood pounding in his temples. He wanted to jump out of the car and rush into the house, but instead he pulled out his phone and turned on the smart home app. The camera showed Laura opening the door, her smile bright, as if she'd been waiting for this visit all week. Mark walked in, they hugged, and the door closed. Jack stared at the screen, his breathing ragged. He had written it down, more proof, another nail in the coffin of their marriage. He didn't know what he would do with it, but he knew he wouldn't let it go on without consequences. He drove away as the lights went out in the living room, unable to watch any longer. The next day, Jack met with Elizabeth again. She looked over the tapes, her face expressionless, but Jack noticed how her lips tightened when she saw Mark. "That's strong evidence," she said, putting her laptop down. "If you decide to file for divorce, it could give you favorable terms. But there's another option, negotiation. You can use this to discuss with Laura what you want: reconciliation, division of property, whatever." Reconciliation. Jack almost laughed, but the laughter caught in his throat. "She kissed my friend, the principal of her school, some third guy. What kind of reconciliation is that?" Elizabeth looked at him, her gaze calm but firm. "I'm not saying you have to forgive. I'm saying you have leverage. Decide what you want, and we'll do it right." Jack nodded, though his thoughts were chaotic. He wanted Laura to feel the pain he felt. He wanted Mark and David to pay for their betrayal. But most of all, he wanted to understand why. Why Laura, the woman he loved, the woman he considered his soulmate, had chosen this. He went back to the motel, opened his laptop, and began writing a letter to Laura. Not to send, but to himself, to get out what was boiling inside. Laura, I saw everything. I know about David, about Mark, about the other one. Why did you do this? What did I do wrong? He wrote, erased, wrote again, but words could not convey the depth of his pain. He closed the laptop and lay down, staring at the ceiling until the darkness swallowed him. Jack didn't know how far he'd go, but he wanted to be prepared for any outcome. He rented a small office in downtown Austin, away from their home, and moved his files there. He bought a safe to store the drives and installed additional encryption. The precautions he'd taken in his work were now armor in his personal war. He also began gathering information about David and Mark. David Reynolds, the school's principal, was married with two teenage daughters and a reputation as a family man. His LinkedIn profile was filled with posts about school events and leadership quotes, but to Jack, he was now a hypocrite with his arm around Laura's waist in their living room. Mark Haley, his former friend, was a bachelor whose construction firm depended on contracts with local developers. A scandal could derail his business, and Jack, with his cybersecurity skills, knew how to find vulnerabilities not just in systems, but in people. He sat in a rented office, the only decorations a map of Austin on the wall and a coffee maker humming in the corner. His laptop was open, showing Mark's social media profile, where he was bragging about a new condo development on the city's east side. Jack remembered their last poker game, a month ago, when Mark had laughed and clapped him on the shoulder and called him brother. Now the words sounded like betrayal, and Jack felt anger boiling inside him, not hot, but cold, calculating, like an algorithm he could code to destroy. He dialed Mark's number, not knowing what he would say, but feeling he had to hear his voice. The phone rang for a long time, and when Mark finally answered, his tone was as carefree as ever. "Jack, man," he said, and Jack could hear the construction noise in the background. "How's things in Seattle? Got your $1 million contract?" Jack clenched his fist, his nails digging into his palm. He wanted to scream, to ask how Mark could come into his house, touch his wife, but instead his voice was flat, almost icy. "Back already," he said. "I thought I'd drop by for some poker on Friday. You in?" Mark hesitated, just for a second, but Jack caught it. Yeah, I guess," Mark replied. "But I'm really busy at work right now. Maybe next week." "Sure," Jack said, his voice calm but seething inside. "See you later, Mark." He hung up before Mark could answer. He knew Mark was lying not about work, but about everything else. Jack opened the smart home app and checked the records for the last few hours. Laura was home alone, cooking dinner, her movements slow, almost mechanical. But he knew it was only a matter of time. She didn't know he was back, and that gave him an advantage. The next evening, Jack parked a block away again, his gray sedan lost in the shadows of the oak trees. He sat in the car, looking at their house, where the light was on in the kitchen. His phone was connected to the cameras, and he could see Laura sitting at the table with a glass of wine, her hair down, wearing the same black dress he'd seen in one of the videos. He waited, his heart beating steadily, but inside he felt a storm. At 8:15 p.m., a familiar black SUV pulled up. Mark got out, his steps confident, as if he'd been there before. Jack gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He turned on the camera by the front door, capturing every moment. Laura opening the door, Mark hugging her, them disappearing inside. He didn't watch any further. He knew what would be on video, and he didn't want to see his friend and his wife betray him in their own home again. Instead, he started the car and drove away, his thoughts clearer than ever. He wasn't going to make a scene, wasn't going to burst in screaming. His revenge would be different, cold, methodical, like the system he'd spent years building. The next morning, Jack met Elizabeth Carter at a cafe near her office. She was sitting at a corner table, an espresso, and an open notebook in front of her. Jack sat across from her, his face pale but his eyes blazing with determination. "I want to move on," he said without preamble. "I've gathered all the evidence. I want Laura to know what I know, but not yet. And I want whoever did this to pay." Elizabeth looked at him, her gaze appraising but not condemning. "Okay," she said, making a note. "Let's go over this. You mentioned the school principal and your friend. Is there anyone else? The third man, Jack said, handing her the flash drive with the new recordings. I don't know who he is, but I have his face, his voice, his time. I want you to find him. We can hire a private investigator if you want to identify him, Elizabeth suggested. But let's define the purpose. Do you want to file for divorce or something else? You mentioned that you want them to pay. What does that mean to you? Jack paused, looking at his hands. He thought of Laura, her laughter with Mark, her hand on David's shoulder. He thought of the years they had spent together, the dreams they had shared. But now those dreams had been crushed, and he wanted those who had done this to feel the consequences. I want David to lose his reputation, he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. He's the headmaster. He can't get away with it. Mark, he was my friend. I want his business to suffer. And Laura, I want her to know I saw it all, but not right away. I want her to feel like she's losing control, just like I did. Elizabeth nodded, her face calm, but Jack noticed how she gripped her pen a little tighter. It's possible, she said. We can use evidence to apply pressure. For David, it might be the threat of publicity. Schools don't like scandals, especially those involving management. For your friend, we can look into his business, find his weak spots. As for Laura, we can prepare divorce papers and present them at the right moment. But Jack, I have to ask, are you sure you want this? Revenge may be satisfying, but it won't bring back what you've lost. Jack looked into her eyes, his gaze cold as steel. I don't want to go back to what was, he said. I want them to understand what they've done. Elizabeth nodded, closing her notebook. Then let's begin, she said. I'll prepare the paperwork and begin gathering information on the third man. You continue to record everything you can, but be careful. Don't do anything that might hurt your case. Jack returned to his temporary office, his mind more focused than ever. He installed audio analysis software to isolate the third man's voice and try to identify him through public records. He also began to study Mark's business, using his cybersecurity skills to find vulnerabilities not to hack, but to see where he could push. He discovered that Mark's firm had recently won a major construction contract, but was on edge because of delivery delays. One call to the right place, one email hinting at a scandal, could destroy his reputation. As for David, Jack found his profile in the school database and began collecting information about his career. He learned that David was a candidate for promotion to the Regional Board of Education, and a cheating scandal could ruin his chances. Jack wasn't sure how far he'd go, but the thought of David losing his perfect family man facade gave him a dark satisfaction. Austin awoke to the soft light of a June morning, its streets filled with the hum of traffic and the aroma of coffee from sidewalk cafes. Jack Wallace sat in his temporary office, a small, bare-walled space where the only sounds were the hum of the air conditioner and the tap of his fingers on the keyboard. He hadn't slept more than 5 hours a night since he'd returned to the city, but his mind was sharp as a blade, honed with anger and determination. On the desk in front of him were 3 external drives, each encrypted with a level of security that rivaled his client's banking systems. On the screen of his laptop glowed an email from Elizabeth Carter, his lawyer, with a draft of his divorce papers. He hadn't signed it yet, but every time he opened the document, he felt something inside him tighten, not in pain, but in a strange relief, as if he were finally taking control of the chaos that had become his life. Jack knew his next move had to be as precise as the code he wrote for Securipath Solutions. He didn't want impulsive action, no shouting or drama. His revenge had to be cold, measured, like a game of chess, with every move bringing him closer to victory. He started with David Reynolds, the principal at Laura's school. Jack spent 2 days gathering information: David's schedule, his public appearances, his connections on the school board. He found his email address on the school's website and created an anonymous account through which he sent a complaint to the education department. The letter was brief but venomous: accusations of inappropriate behavior, a hint of incriminating evidence that could be turned over if necessary. He didn't attach the video yet. He wanted David to feel the pressure, to see his otherwise impeccable reputation begin to fray before he struck. Next up was Mark Haley, his former friend. Jack knew Mark better than he knew David, which made the betrayal all the more bitter. He remembered their poker nights, Mark teasing him about his cautious play, drinking beer, and discussing life. Now those memories were poisoned, and Jack used his knowledge to find a weak spot. He researched Mark's construction firm through public records and found it teetering on the brink of delivery delays and customer complaints. Jack drafted a letter addressed to a key developer Mark worked with and sent it from another anonymous account. In it, he hinted at questionable business practices and offered to review Mark's contracts. He knew that one such letter would be enough to trigger an audit that could freeze Mark's projects for months. But the hardest part was the one involving Laura. Jack wasn't ready for a direct confrontation and didn't want to see her eyes when she realized he knew. Instead, he planned something more subtle, a surprise that would make her feel the same helplessness he felt watching the security footage. He started small, sending her a bouquet of flowers at school, with a card signed simply, "From someone who knows." He imagined her reading the note, her smile fading, her eyes looking around for answers. It was a first step, a hint that her secrets weren't just hers anymore. He also had a book delivered to her Othello Shakespeare to their home, with a bookmark on the stage where Iago sows the seeds of doubt. Laura, the literature teacher, would get the hint, and Jack wanted her to start asking questions. That evening, Jack met Elizabeth Carter again in her office. She was sitting at her desk, looking over printouts of his notes, her face focused but her eyes slightly worried. "Jack," she began, putting the papers aside, "are you sure you want to go this route? Complaints, anonymous letters, flowers, and notes, it's a dangerous game. If this is discovered, you could lose your moral advantage in court." Jack looked at her, his gaze hard as granite. "I don't want the moral high ground," he said. "I want them to feel like their world is crumbling, just like mine is." Elizabeth sighed but nodded. "Good. The divorce notice is ready. I added the infidelity clause, citing your evidence. If you sign, we can send it to Laura tomorrow. But I must warn you, once she receives it, it will be real. There is no turning back." Jack took the document, his fingers running over the lines. Notice of dissolution of marriage on the grounds of proven infidelity. He imagined Laura opening the envelope, her face turning pale as she tried to figure out how he knew. He almost signed, but stopped. "Give me a day," he said. "I want her to receive my gift first." Elizabeth narrowed her eyes, but didn't argue. "Be careful, Jack," she said. "You're playing with fire." He nodded, but there was no fear in his eyes, only cold determination. He walked out of the office, feeling like every step brought him closer to the moment when Laura would realize that her secrets were out. That night, Jack parked near the house again, his sedan hidden in the shade of the trees. He looked at their house, where the light was on in the bedroom. Laura was there, perhaps reading or preparing for a lecture. He opened the smart home app and checked the cameras. She was sitting at the desk in her office, her face focused, but there was something new in her movements, nervousness, as if she sensed something was wrong. Jack noticed a book on her desk, Othello. She opened it, leafed through it, and found the bookmark. Her fingers paused, and even through the camera, Jack could see her frown, her eyes running over the lines. He knew she'd gotten the hint, and that gave him a grim satisfaction. The next day, the flowers arrived at the school. Jack received a delivery note confirming the delivery. He imagined Laura opening the box, reading the note, her heart skipping a beat. He didn't know what she would think, but he wanted her to be afraid. He also sent an anonymous letter to the school board, alluding to David Reynolds's unprofessional behavior. He didn't mention Laura, but he knew the investigation would affect her and make her feel the pressure. That evening he called Mark, his voice calm but seething inside. Mark answered with the same casual intonation that now sounded false to Jack. "Jack, old man," said Mark, "decided to play poker after all." "Not exactly," Jack replied, his tone even but sharp as a blade. "Just wanted to check in. I heard you were having problems with the developer. Something about delays." Mark hesitated, his voice becoming less confident. Yeah, a little complicated. How do you know? Austin's a small town, Jack said, letting the words hang in the air. Word travels fast. He hung up before Mark could respond. He knew his letter to the developer was already working, sowing doubt that could destroy Mark's business. He felt like a strategist moving pieces on a board, but this wasn't a game for fun, it was war. Jack returned to his office and opened his laptop. He began working on the final part of his plan, the surprise for Laura that would be the climax. He ordered a projector and screen, which he planned to set up in their living room while Laura was at work. He was going to edit a video, not just the security footage, but a movie with every moment of her betrayal shown in chronological order, with subtitles listing dates and names. He wanted her to see herself from the outside, to understand that her actions had consequences. He worked on the edit all night, his eyes reddened, but he did not stop. He added music, a slow, ominous melody that would heighten the drama. He didn't know when he would show it to her, but he wanted it to be ready. The next day, he met with a private investigator Elizabeth had recommended. The man, Ryan, was a tired-looking ex-cop who chewed on a toothpick. Jack gave him a photo of the third man and the audio recordings. "Find out who he is," Jack said. "I need to know everything. Name, job, connections, and fast." Ryan nodded without asking any further questions. "Give me a couple of days," he said. "If he's local, I'll find him." Jack walked away, feeling his plan gathering momentum. He didn't know who the third man would be, but he was prepared for any outcome. He also began setting the stage for the final act. He wanted Laura, David, and Mark to all face the consequences at the same time. He imagined Laura getting a divorce notice, David being called before the Board of Education, Mark losing his contract. He wanted them all to feel like their world was crumbling, just like his was. That evening, Jack parked near the house again. He watched the lights in the windows, Laura's shadow moving through the rooms. He opened the app and saw her sitting in the living room, holding the note from the flowers. Her face was pale, her eyes darting restlessly around the room. He knew she was beginning to suspect that someone knew her secret. He wanted to go up to her, knock on the door, but instead he stayed in the car. He wasn't ready for a confrontation, not yet. He wanted her to feel the pressure building, to let her own thoughts become her punishment. He returned to the motel, lay down on the bed, and closed his eyes. For the first time in days, he felt not pain but power. He was no longer a victim, but a man who held the strings in his hands. He didn't know how this story would end, but he knew that Laura, David, and Mark would pay for what they had done. And when the time came, he would be ready to look them in the eye. Austin was buzzing in the hot June sun, its streets ablaze with brightly colored signs and crowds going about their business. But in the Hyde Park neighborhood, where oak trees cast shadows over neat lawns, a storm was brewing that no one had yet suspected. Jack Wallace, sitting in his temporary office downtown, stared at the screen of his laptop, where the list of items for the auction was almost complete. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, but not with indecision. He was calm, like an engineer completing a complex project. Every item on the list had been carefully chosen. Laura's dresses, her jewelry, the books with her notes, even the bed they had shared for 6 years. This was not just an auction, it was an act of purification, a public declaration that he would no longer live in the shadow of her betrayal. Jack had spent the last 3 days preparing. He had rented a small storage unit on the outskirts of town and moved Laura's things from their home into it. He had worked at night while Laura was away at lectures or out with friends, carefully gathering up everything that had connected her to their life. Her silk dresses that she had worn to parties, her pearl necklace that had been a gift to them on their 3rd anniversary, her favorite chair in the study where she had read her novels, all of it was now in boxes labeled with lot numbers. He felt no joy in sorting through these things, but he felt a strange relief, as if with each item he were cutting away a piece of the past. He created a website for the auction, using his programming skills to make it simple but effective. The main page featured the headline, "Cleanse Your House from Lies Below," a description written in cold but poetic language. "For sale, anything related to betrayal." Each item is a story that no longer serves a purpose. Start over. He didn't mention Laura's name, but anyone who knew them would understand. He also hired an auctioneer, an older man named Frank, whose voice was as loud as Texas thunder, and rented out a site, an open lawn in a local park that was usually used for farmers' markets. The auction was set for Saturday, and Jack sent out anonymous invitations via social media, local forums, and even a few anonymous letters to newspapers. He wanted to get the word out. By Wednesday, the story was starting to gain momentum. A local blogger known for his Austin gossip had stumbled upon the auction site and posted, "Someone in Hyde Park is throwing a sale with a twist. Cleanse your home of lies sounds like a soap opera drama." The post quickly spread across social media, and by evening, a local radio station was mentioning the auction on its morning show, calling it the most intriguing event of the week. Jack read the comments online from his office and watched people theorize. Divorce, revenge, public humiliation. Some called the organizer a lone hero, others a bitter ex. Jack didn't comment, but every like, every share was fuel for his resolve. He knew Laura didn't suspect anything yet. She went on with her life, unaware that he was back, that he had seen everything he was cooking. He watched her through the smart home cameras, noticing how her movements were becoming increasingly nervous. She checked her phone frequently, frowned when she read messages, and one day he saw her throw a note from the flowers into the trash can with such force that it seemed to be erased from reality. Jack knew that his hints, the book, the flowers, the anonymous letters were starting to work. She sensed that something was wrong, but she couldn't figure out what. On Thursday, Jack met Elizabeth Carter at a cafe on South Congress. She sat at a table by the window, her coffee growing cold as she looked over the last of the paperwork. Jack sat across from her, his face pale, but his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "Have you heard about my auction?" he asked, wasting no time on greetings. Elizabeth looked up, her eyebrows raised. "I heard," she said, her tone cautious. "Half of Austin is talking about it. Jack, are you sure this is wise? It's public humiliation, and it could backfire on you in court. The judge might see it as an attempt to embarrass Laura." "Let her," Jack said, his voice as hard as concrete. "I don't want her to just sign the papers and walk away. I want her to feel like she's lost everything like I did." Elizabeth sighed, her fingers tapping on the table. "The divorce notice is ready," she said. "I can send it out tomorrow, before the auction. It will add impact, but it will also make you a target for criticism. People will start asking questions, and Laura might hire a lawyer who will use your auction against you." "I'm ready for it," Jack said. "Send the notice Friday night. I want her to get it before the auction so she knows it's over." Elizabeth nodded, but her eyes were full of worry. "What about David and Mark?" she asked. "The complaint against the principal has already caused a stir at the school board. I heard they've launched an internal investigation, and your friend, his developer, has requested an audit. Are you sure you want to keep pushing them?" Jack looked out the window at the people hurrying down the sidewalk, unaware of his personal war. "They made a choice," he said. "Now let them live with the consequences." Elizabeth didn't answer, but she made a note on her pad. She handed Jack a folder of copies of the divorce papers, and a report from a private investigator about the third man. His name was Ethan Crow, an artist whose work had been shown in local galleries. Jack skimmed the report. Ethan was divorced, lived in a loft on Austin's east side, and apparently knew Laura through Emily, her friend. Jack kept the information, but decided that Ethan was a lesser target than David and Mark. His first priority was Laura. Friday came quickly. Jack spent the morning checking out the auction details. He personally inspected the site in the park, where workers were setting up a tent and laying out chairs. Frank, the auctioneer, walked around with a clipboard, checking off the list of lots. Jack handed him a box of Laura's personal belongings, the journal he'd found in a dresser drawer, her favorite earrings, even her laptop, where she'd kept drafts of her never-written novel. He felt no compunction about sorting through them. Each item was a symbol of a lie he wanted to erase from his life. That evening, Elizabeth confirmed that the divorce notice had been sent. A courier delivered it to the Hyde Park house at 6 p.m., and Jack watched through the cameras as Laura opened the envelope. Her face went pale, her hands trembled as she read the document. She collapsed on the sofa, clutching the papers, and Jack saw her cover her face with her hands. He felt no pity, only a cold satisfaction that she had finally realized that her secrets had been revealed. By nightfall, local media had picked up the auction story. A journalist from Fromeston Chronicle wrote an article titled "Revenge in Hyde Park, Mysterious Auction Promises Drama." There were no names in the article, but rumors were already spreading, and posts with the hashtag #CleanYourHouse began appearing on social media. Some called the organizer a lone hero who was fighting betrayal, while others condemned him for publicly humiliating himself. Jack read all of this from his motel room, feeling his plan gathering momentum like a storm about to hit the city. Saturday began with clear skies and a light breeze that carried the scent of freshly cut grass. Hyde Park was full of people, nosy neighbors, reporters, bloggers, even random passers-by drawn by rumors. Jack stood off to the side, wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap to avoid attention. He watched the crowd gather around the tent. Frank checked the microphone, and boxes of Laura's things being carried out onto the makeshift stage. Among the items on display were her dresses, neatly hung on hangers, her jewelry laid out on velvet cushions, and even her favorite stained glass lamp that they had bought together at a flea market. Frank began the auction, his voice booming over the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the auction. Cleanse your home of lies. Today, we have a unique opportunity to get rid of the past and start anew. The first lot is an elegant black dress, a symbol of freedom that turned out to be a lie. The starting bid is $10. The crowd murmured, some laughed, some raised their hands. Jack watched as Laura's dress went for $30 to a woman in a bright sundress. Her earrings were next, then the diary, which had caused a stir among bloggers hoping to find some juicy details. Jack didn't know what was in the diary, he hadn't opened it, didn't want to read her thoughts. But he wanted it gone, like everything else. By midday, the auction was in full swing, and the media began filming the event. A reporter from a local TV station walked around with a microphone, asking participants. "It's like modern-day revenge," said one of the customers, a man with tattoos on his arms. "Someone decided not just to get a divorce, but to do it loudly." "That's cruel," the middle-aged woman said, holding Laura's purse. "But I understand. Betrayal hurts." Jack listened, standing in the shade of a tree, and felt his plan come to life. He hadn't expected the auction to attract so much attention, but now that it was a sensation, he knew Laura couldn't ignore it. She hadn't come, he'd been checking the cameras and knew she was home, locked in her bedroom. But she would hear, she would know, and that was part of his plan. By evening, the auction was over. Everything Laura had owned had been sold, from her shoes to her favorite mirror. The proceeds totaled several $1,000s, which Jack planned to donate to charity, a shelter for women who had suffered from domestic violence. He didn't want the money. He wanted Laura to know that her life with him had been erased, like a file that had been deleted beyond repair. He returned to the motel, his phone buzzing with notifications. Social media was buzzing with posts about the auction, and the hashtag #CleanYourHouse was trending in Austin. Jack opened his laptop and saw an email from Elizabeth. "Laura has hired a lawyer. She wants to meet. Be prepared." He smiled, but it was a bitter smile. He knew Laura would try to fight it, but he was one step ahead. His final move was yet to come. He finished editing the video, an hour-long clip that captured every moment of her betrayal with the precision worthy of his profession. He added subtitles, giving names David, Mark, Ethan, and dates, so there would be no doubt. He didn't know if he'd show it to Laura, but he wanted it ready. He imagined her staring at the screen, her face contorted in horror, realizing she'd lost everything. Jack lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. He felt both victorious and defeated. He had destroyed their world, but his own was in ruins. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, he dreamed not of Laura, not of betrayal, but of an empty road stretching off into the horizon, where he was alone but free. The downtown Austin courtroom was chilly, despite the June heat outside. The air conditioners hummed, creating a white noise that mingled with the muffled conversations of the lawyers and the creaking of the chairs. Jack Wallace sat at the table next to Elizabeth Carter, his attorney, his hands in his lap, his fingers curled into fists hidden under the table. He wore the dark gray suit he wore only for important business meetings, but today he felt less like a businessman than a man standing on the edge of a precipice of his own making. Across the aisle from him, Laura sat, her red hair pulled back into a tight bun, her face, usually animated and expressive, pale, with dark circles under her eyes. She avoided his gaze, her fingers nervously fiddling with the edge of the file in front of her. The courtroom was nearly empty, just the judge, a few clerks, and Laura's attorney, a sharp-featured young woman who glanced at Jack with professional wariness. Word of the Clean Your Home of Lies auction was still buzzing in Austin, but the court was businesslike, as if the world outside had ceased to exist. Jack could feel his heart beating steadily, but inside him there was a storm, not anger, not pain, but something new, cold and unyielding, like the steel frame of his resolve. The judge, an elderly woman with short gray hair and a stern gaze, opened the session, her voice as dry as the pages of legal documents. "We are here to hear the case of divorce between Jack Wallace and Laura Wallace," she began, leafing through a file. "Mr. Wallace has filed suit on the grounds of proven infidelity. Does the defendant object?" Laura's attorney, who introduced herself as Caitlin Morris, stood up, her voice confident but controlled. "Your Honor, my client acknowledges the breakdown of the relationship, but asks that you consider the possibility of reconciliation or an equitable division of property. We also challenge certain actions by the plaintiff, including the public sale of Mrs. Wallace's personal belongings, which we believe constitutes an attempt to humiliate her." Elizabeth Carter stood up immediately, her tone sharp as a blade. "Your Honor, my client's actions were in response to repeated acts of infidelity on the part of Mrs. Wallace, as documented by video recordings and other evidence presented to the court. We ask for a complete dissolution of the marriage without division of property, given the circumstances." The judge nodded, her gaze sliding from Laura to Jack. "I want to hear from both sides. Mrs. Wallace, do you have anything to say?" Laura stood up slowly, her hands shaking but trying to keep herself together. She finally looked at Jack, and her green eyes flashed with a mixture of pain, shame, and despair. He met her gaze, but his face remained motionless, like a mask. He didn't want to give her any sign of weakness. "Jack," she began, her voice quiet but the tremor in it clear for all to hear. "I know what you saw, everything. And I know what you did, the auction, the letters, all of it. I don't blame you for being angry. I made a mistake. No, not a mistake, I betrayed you. And I can't turn back time, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to end this way." She fell silent, her eyes filling with tears, but she blinked quickly, trying to hold them back. "I don't know why I did it," she continued, her voice a little louder but still brittle. "Maybe because I felt lost, like our life had become a cage. I wanted something more, something alive, but I didn't want to lose you. I love you, Jack, despite everything. And I'm begging you to give me a chance to explain myself, to start over." Jack listened, his face unmoving. He saw the tears in her eyes, heard the tremor in her voice, but it didn't touch him. He remembered the footage from the cameras, her laughing with David, her dancing with Mark, her kissing Ethan. He remembered her lying to him on the phone, her voice growing colder with each call. He remembered the auction, where her things were sold under the hammer, strangers watching with curiosity. And all he felt was the emptiness where there had once been love. "Mr. Wallace," the judge said, turning to him, "do you wish to answer?" Jack stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked at Laura, but his eyes were cold as a winter morning. "Your Honor," he began, his voice level, without a trace of emotion. "I don't want a reconciliation. I don't want an explanation. Mrs. Wallace made her choice, and I made mine. I presented evidence of her infidelity, and I ask that we end this marriage without division of property. I built our life, our home, our business, everything we had. She chose to destroy it. I don't have to share what's left with her." Laura flinched, as if his words had struck her. She opened her mouth to speak, but her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder, silencing her. The judge looked at them both, then looked back at her paperwork. "I will make a decision after reviewing all the evidence," she said. "The hearing will continue in a week. The parties may prepare additional materials." After the hearing, Jack walked out of the courtroom without looking back. He heard Laura calling his name, but he didn't stop. He walked through the marble courtroom, where his footsteps echoed like a metronome, counting down the end of their marriage. Outside, the sun was blinding, and he put on sunglasses to hide the weariness that was beginning to show on his face. Elizabeth caught up with him at the exit, her heels clicking on the sidewalk. "You've been a good boy," she said, adjusting her bag on her shoulder. "But Laura and her lawyer will fight. They may try to challenge the auction as an illegal seizure." "Let them try," Jack replied, his voice quiet but firm. "I sold everything legally. The house is mine, and everything in it. She's not getting anything." Elizabeth looked at him, her eyes full of concern. "Jack, are you sure you're not overreacting?" she asked. "I understand your anger, but you've already struck a blow: the auction, the complaints, the publicity. Maybe you should stop." Jack shook his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll stop when this is over," he said. "She wanted freedom. Let her find out what it tastes like." The week before the next meeting was a frantic preparation. Jack returned to his office, where the safe with the discs became his altar, and his laptop his weapon. He continued to gather information, although his actions were now less visible. The complaint against David Reynolds had led to his suspension as principal, and the local papers were already reporting on the Hyde Park school scandal. Mark Haley had lost his contract with a developer, and his firm was in danger of going bankrupt. Jack felt no joy, but he felt the satisfaction of a programmer whose code runs without errors. He also continued to monitor Laura through the cameras, though it was more of a habit than a necessity now. She rarely left the house, her movements sluggish, as if she were carrying an invisible weight on her shoulders. He saw her sitting in the living room, staring at the empty space where her furniture had once stood. He saw her cry, but it didn't fill him with pity, only a cold awareness that she was reaping what she had sown. The night before the final hearing, Jack met with private investigator Ryan, who gave him the full report on Ethan Crow. The artist was a minor player in the drama. His connection with Laura had been fleeting, more of a whim than anything serious. Jack decided to leave him alone, focusing on the main players. He also finished editing his video, an hour-long chronicle of Laura's betrayal that he had been keeping as his final weapon. He wasn't sure if he'd show it in court, but he wanted it ready. The final session went by faster than Jack expected. The judge heard both sides' arguments, reviewed the evidence, and made her decision. Laura sat silently, her eyes downcast and her hands clasped on the edge of the table. The judge spoke, her voice dry and businesslike. "Given the evidence of infidelity on the part of Mrs. Wallace and the lack of marital property to divide, I grant Mr. Wallace's motion for divorce without disposition of the property. Mrs. Wallace, your actions, as evidenced by the video recordings, preclude any claim to assets acquired by Mr. Wallace before and during the marriage." Laura closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping. Her lawyer tried to object, but the judge raised her hand, cutting her off. "As for the auction," the judge continued, "I find no grounds for declaring it illegal, since the property was in the possession of Mr. Wallace. The case is closed." Jack looked at Laura, waiting for her to speak again, to apologize, to try to change something. But she remained silent, her face blank as a clean slate. When the judge adjourned the trial, Laura stood up and walked out of the courtroom without looking at Jack. He felt something snap inside him, as if the last thread that connected them had snapped. After the trial, Jack returned to his house in Hyde Park. He walked through the rooms, which now seemed empty despite the new furniture he had ordered. He stopped in the living room, where the couch had once stood, where Laura had kissed other men. There was a new couch there now, gray and minimalist, like his new life. He sat down, opened his laptop, and deleted the smart home app. The cameras were no longer needed. They had served their purpose. He knew Laura had left Austin. Emily, her friend, had written to tell him that Laura had rented an apartment in Dallas and was planning to start over. Jack didn't answer. He didn't want to know what would happen to her. He had kept his house, his business, his reputation, but the victory was bittersweet. He sat in silence, watching the sunset outside his window, and felt the illusions he had spent years building finally dissolve. He was free, but this freedom was empty, like the house in which he was left alone. Colorado greeted Jack Wallace with the scent of pine and the cool mountain air. He stood on the porch of his new home, a one-story cedar and stone cottage nestled in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains just outside Boulder. The house was modest but airy, with large windows that looked out over snow-capped peaks and a valley where the wind whipped clouds like a herd of wild horses. Jack had chosen the place for its quiet, its distance from the noise of Austin, where every corner was a reminder of the past. Here in the mountains, he felt he could breathe not freely, not easily, but enough to begin again. It had been a month since the Austin court had ended his marriage to Laura. Jack had sold their Hyde Park house without looking back and moved his belongings to Colorado. He had taken nothing that would remind him of her, no photos, no mementos, not even that Mitt coffee mug she liked to use. His new life was a blank slate, and he had left it intentionally empty to fill it with something new, something that was his alone. Jack sat at a wooden desk in his new office, where the glass walls of his Austin office were replaced by logs that smelled of tar. His laptop was open, and on the screen was a presentation for a new division of his company, SecurePath Solutions. He called the project Loyalty, a surveillance system designed specifically for families who wanted to protect their homes, not just from external threats, but from internal ones. It wasn't just a system of cameras and sensors. It was an entire ecosystem, including encrypted communications, behavioral analytics, and real-time alerts. Jack had poured all his knowledge, all his experience, and most importantly, his pain into it. He knew that trust was a fragile thing, and he wanted to give people the tools to protect it, or at least know the truth when it was broken. Loyalty had already attracted attention. After the Austin auction, Jack's name had become known not only in Texas, but also beyond. The media called him a lone hero, a man who had cleaned up his home of betrayal and turned a personal tragedy into a business idea. Reporters from Denver and Seattle called asking for interviews, but Jack refused. He didn't want to be a hero or a victim. He wanted to be a man moving forward. His company was thriving. A contract with a Seattle bank had brought in large investments, and loyalty was already being tested in several Colorado cities. Customers, from young families to older couples, praised the system for its intuitiveness and reliability. Jack read their reviews, but he didn't smile. Success was nice, but it didn't fill the void Laura had left. The Colorado evenings were quiet, and Jack spent them on the porch, drinking black coffee, watching the sunset paint the mountains crimson and gold. He thought about trust, how it takes years to build, only to be shattered in an instant. He thought about Laura, her tears in court, her words that he had rejected. He didn't hate her, but he didn't regret her either. She was part of his past, like old code he had rewritten to create something better. But the betrayal had left scars, invisible but deep, and Jack knew they would never completely disappear. He didn't become bitter, but he became colder, more attentive to people. He noticed little things: how a colleague looked away, how a neighbor spoke too quickly, how a smile didn't reach his eyes. He didn't become cynical, but he learned to set boundaries. His heart still believed in love, but now he knew that love required protection, like a system requires a firewall. He didn't look for new relationships, didn't go on dates, didn't respond to careful hints from colleagues. He was alone, but this loneliness was not a punishment, but a choice. One evening, as the wind carried the smell of rain from the mountains, Jack found a letter in the mailbox. The envelope was plain, with no return address, no signature, just his name, written in neat handwriting. He knew who it was from letters like this had arrived 3 times in the last month, always unsigned, always with the same message: apologies, regrets, pleas for forgiveness. He did not open them. He held the envelope in his hands, feeling its lightness, its fragility, as if it might crumble at a single touch. He went outside to the small brazier he used to light a fire on cold evenings. He lit a match, watched the flames come to life, and tossed the letter into the fire. The paper caught fire, the edges curled, and the words he would never read disappeared in the flames. He felt no anger or relief, only a calm, as if he had closed another door in the past. Jack had heard about Laura through mutual friends, though he had never asked. Emily, her friend, had written to him once, telling him that Laura had changed her last name and moved to Vermont, where she taught literature at a private school. She was living a quiet life, avoiding social media and, in Emily's words, trying to find herself. Jack didn't respond. He didn't want to know if she was happy, lonely, or regretful. She was part of another life, and he wasn't looking back. His new home became his sanctuary. He furnished it simply: wooden furniture, a few books on programming, a couple of paintings of Colorado landscapes. He began running in the mornings, on trails that wound through the pine trees, feeling the cold air fill his lungs and his thoughts clear. He got a dog, a Labrador named Rex, whose energy made him laugh for the first time in months. Rex greeted him at the door, wagging his tail, and Jack found something akin to healing in this simple ritual. Securipath Solutions continued to grow. Loyalty was a hit, and Jack hired a new team of engineers to expand the project. He spent his days in an office in Boulder, where glass walls gave way to mountain views, and his employees were young, ambitious, and knew nothing of his past. To them, he was just the boss, strict but fair, a man who could solve any problem given enough time and coffee. He didn't talk about Laura, or the auction, or the trial. It was his story, and he kept it to himself, like an encrypted file accessible only to him. But at night, when Rex slept by the fire and the mountains beyond his window were dark, Jack thought about what he had lost and what he had found. He thought about trust, how it had meant everything to him until it had been broken. He thought about betrayal, how it had taught him to see people for who they were, not for who he wanted them to be. And he thought about healing, not fast, not complete, but gradual, like a system rebuilding after a crash. He was not the old Jack, but this new Jack was stronger, wiser, with boundaries no one would cross again. One day, when Jack returned from a run, he found another letter in the mailbox. The same handwriting, the same white envelope, the same smell of paper that reminded him of the past. He picked it up, feeling his fingers tighten around the edges, but he didn't open it. He walked to the brazier, lit a fire, and watched as the flames consumed the envelope, turning it to ash. He didn't know what was inside: apologies, justifications, pleas. It didn't matter. Laura was in the past, and he wasn't going to go back there, even for a reply. He went back into the house, poured himself a coffee, and sat down at his laptop. The new version of Loyalty glowed on the screen, an update that allowed users to set up alerts for suspicious activity. He smiled, feeling for the first time in a long time that his work had meaning. He couldn't protect his past, but he could help others protect their future. Jack Wallace looked out the window at the mountains, feeling the cool breeze. He was alone, but not lonely. He was free, but not empty. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of pain and determination, he still believed that one day he would find love, real love, with the boundaries he had learned to set. But for now, he was content with this moment, the silence, the mountains, and the new beginning he had built with his own hands. Each story is a step towards understanding yourself and the world. If this story left a mark on your soul, don't forget to support it with a like and a comment. Subscribe, because it only gets stronger, deeper, and more interesting. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.